Well, g'day. I'm Roland Hearn, and this is A Walk in the Garden. I'm really excited and happy and delighted to have my good friend Tom Oord with me today. Not walking in the garden, as you can see, but I am in my office speaking with Tom across, I guess it's about 8,000 miles. So g'day, Tom. How you doing?
Doing well, Roland. Thanks so much for the chance to have this conversation.
Well, I can't tell you how excited I am for this opportunity. We met virtually about 20 odd years ago. I was planting a church in Texas with a very good friend of mine, Brad Mercer, who passed away 13 years ago. That's hard to believe.
Wow.
And we were trying to build a church consistently around the theme of love, and that if it doesn't have anything to do with love, we're not going to do it. And I felt somewhat alone in that process. I mean, there were a lot of good books that were helpful in that process that centered on love. Dunning and Great House and Wynkoop and, of course, John Wesley were all pieces of that puzzle. But there wasn't any active engagement that I saw at that time that related to what it means to actually live in the space of love and the consequences of that for the church. And then we were chatting together on NASNet, and your name started popping up, and it hadn't been long after I think you completed your PhD, and you were saying pretty much the same things, and I felt very excited at that point in time to have somebody that knew what they were talking about to be able to say that. So this is a thrill. So Tom, let me introduce you to my audience. You graduated from, I've got notes here, mate, so I'm sorry. You're reading
No problem.
from Northwest Nazarene College in 1988. You pastored for 4 years. Then you went and got your Master of Divinity from Nazarene Theological Seminary, and then went to Claremont Graduate University and earned a Master's of Arts and a PhD at that university. And now you are Director of the doctoral program in Open and Relational Theology at Northwind Theological Seminary. You've written or edited more than 25 books and a host of academic articles that all center around the themes, or most of them center around the themes that we'll be discussing today. So, Tom, your life journey in that process keeps you bringing you back to the same space. Would that be a fair analysis?
Yeah, I think the way I would put it is I have many, many interests, and they go this way and that: science, philosophy, social issues, culture, but the core are the issues of love. In fact,
Right.
As you talked about how many books I had written or edited, I smiled because just recently my wife saw another book that I had put out, and somewhere in, I guess the subtitle, the word love was, and she said, "Every book has got to be about love." I said, well, not really, but I just can't get away from the centrality, at least for me, the centrality of the issues of love for all dimensions of reality.
Right. That's fantastic. That really is. Well, thanks for coming and being a part of this space. I started this little experiment, for want of a better term, or presentation, a walk in the garden, as a result of trying to deal with my own frustrations. When you make love the center of your worldview and hopefully of your ministry, that very much involves presence. And during the COVID crisis, my capacity to actually physically be with people was significantly reduced, and that led to an internalized frustration. That ultimately the idea came to me when I was walking in the garden around my home or mowing the lawn, that I could create videos about my own personal journey and about my perspectives on love and grace, and that would create a form of presence. The idea then became to call it a walk in the garden. Because I'm walking in the garden, but there was reflections of that of the great foundational mythological story of the church. And I explain what a myth is in the very first video. It's not about something not being true. It's something that the facts are not relevant in. It's about the essence of what it's trying to say in terms of identity. And so the garden story is absolutely an identity story for the Jewish faith and for Christians. And so my walk in the garden becomes actually a desire to walk from that space back to the original relational space of Adam and Eve. And so my hope is that there'll be people that watch these videos that don't have any faith at all, and it might be a helpful introduction to the journey of faith without all the baggage that often comes with that. Also Christians that are looking to try and wrestle with issues in their own lives that they're struggling with, that their faith to that point hasn't addressed. And ultimately, for the people that whom I'm responsible for, that might create a common language to talk about the issues of faith. So that's where we're at this morning. Does that sound fair to you, Tom?
It sounds great.
All right. So let's get into it, shall we? Then enough waffle, as we'd say here in Australia. So, Tom, in my last video, I introduced your book, God Cant, because I was trying to very briefly respond to the idea of who God is. Your book, God Cant, is an extension of the book that you wrote on the uncontrolling God, which both represent the idea of essential kenosis. So I wonder if you could unpack that a little bit for us today.
Yeah, I think a lot of folks have an intuition or some kind of sense that there's something bigger than them. Philosophers, we call it transcendence.
Mm-hmm.
Many people call this God. I think latest polls say more than 90% of people have this sense of there's something bigger, more, and yet it's not exactly clear about what that thing is, what this God is, if you believe in God. And I happen to believe in God. And one of the biggest struggles, biggest questions people have is, if there is such a thing called God, and if this God is, as many Christians and Jews and even Muslims say, loving and powerful, then why do we see so much evil in the world? Pointless pain, unnecessary suffering. And for many people, it's personal. They've gone through struggles. They've been abused. They've been mistreated. And so they wonder, well, look, if this God is loving, loves me, cares for me, and is powerful, did this God cause these things to happen to me?
Right.
Or allow them to happen to me? That's more common. God didn't do it to me, but God allowed it. And my view is that a God who either causes or even allows genuine evil is not perfectly loving.
Right.
And so the provocative title of this book, God Can't, is the claim that God can't single-handedly prevent the evils that have happened to you and me and the larger evils in human history.
That word single-handedly is interesting, isn't it? Because you have a specific thought about that, don't you?
Yes. I mean, sometimes people hear me say God can't prevent evil, and they have the idea that, God is on the sidelines, kind of eating popcorn, twiddling his thumbs, looking at what's going on, the coronavirus, injustice, whatever, and just kind of saying, hey, good luck down there. I'm up here doing my thing. In other words, they have a disengaged God of deism.
Right.
But the God I'm proposing, who actually exists, is a God not only of love that's uncontrolling, but is present and active throughout all creation. So back to what you said earlier about presence, that's really powerful and important for my view.
Yeah.
So I like to say this: the God of love, who is present to everyone and everything, can't control anyone or anything. And that's the key idea that I think a lot of folks have grabbed onto this. And now that makes a little more sense given the experience of suffering that I've had.
Right. One of the things that caught my attention years ago was your definition of love, which entails, and I think you might have expanded from here, but entails acting intentionally in sympathetic response to others to promote overall well-being. For me, in my journey, I had very much come to the place where I understood that when you experience love, you experience worth. When you love somebody, you are communicating worth, which is the overall well-being part of that statement. And the implication for that then was that if I was experiencing worthlessness, I wasn't simultaneously effectively experiencing love. And from a Christian perspective, that meant that there was a problem in the way that I was relating to God, which had to be my problem. It was at that point that the controlling part came in, because I'm by nature, I'm not sure that's the right word to use, but I use it anyway, a controlling person, right? I want things to be a certain way, and I work hard at trying to make it that way. And when people don't respond effectively, I raise levels of pressure to get them to respond to the way that I want them to respond. And so when I started recognizing, and I guess I'd have to say I recognized that in my marriage first and foremost, if I wanted to communicate love to my wife, I had to let go. I had to stop controlling. I had to let her become who she really was. And that included things like creating separate check accounts at one period of time, just so that she would recognize, because in a lot of dysfunctional homes and families, marriages, controlling the finances is a form of domination, right? So we went through that process. At that point, I recognized this idea of the will of God, which from our theological perspective, traditionally, we would have said God has this overall picture that isn't necessarily specific, but that he has moments in that desire that he wants us to lead us to, and then we have to choose those things. And as we don't choose them, he ramps up the pressure to get us to choose the right thing, right? And so even in that perspective, we are prone to ideas that would suggest that if there's problems in your life, if you're dealing with issues of struggle, then God's trying to get your attention. He's trying to teach you a lesson, right? So why are you having this trouble? Well, I haven't learned enough patience, and God's teaching me patience. So as soon as I let go of that idea, and then recognize when I love my life, it's in an uncontrolling way. When I love my children, it's an uncontrolling way. When I love my church, it's an uncontrolling way. I thought that has to be the way God is. And it changed everything. But at the end of the day, I find that doesn't sit comfortably with most people's developed framework of who God is. So I wonder if you wouldn't mind speaking to that.
I find that too. You know, the people who like my book the most usually come into three categories. One, there's a big category of people, in fact, they send me letters frequently saying who are victims, who are survivors of abuse, torture, trauma. And for them, this idea that God didn't cause or even allow the bad things that happen to them, that is just such good news. Because if that's not the case, God either is punishing them or abandoned them, or, you know, is manipulating to try to teach some weird lesson by letting a woman be raped. I mean, it just gets really weird once you go down that.
Yeah.
But then there's a second group. I call them the theology nerds. They sort of wrestle with the hard questions of theology, and they stumble upon these ideas. And for them, it's really exciting because this idea not only solves this big question of suffering, but has lots of other implications. In fact, just this week, I have another book coming out called Questions and Answers for God, Cant, in which I apply these ideas to things like prayer, miracles, hope for the end, etc. And then there's the third kind of group, and this is kind of more ambiguous, but I call them the people who are disenfranchised or out of the status quo. And they see the structures that are set up in institutions or governments or businesses, and they're outside of the realms of influence and power, and they're treated unjustly because of that. And they think, okay, now if God is the kind of God who has the power to fix these systemic problems, these evils, and God's not doing it, then, well, I guess maybe God wants all these crazy systems we have that treat me unjustly. And that just doesn't sound like a God of love. So I find that what happens is that people begin to think through the implications of a God who can't control and always loves. And one of the big ones, and your story about talking about your wife and your own story, life history brings this to mind. One of the big ones is that people begin to understand that divine love in general, but God's love included, involves God really being affected by us, really being influenced, really suffering with us. God truly does listen to us. And that's not the view of God you find in Augustine, Martin Luther, Thomas Aquinas, the major theologians in history. And when we apply that in our own lives, in our marriages, our partnerships, whatever, all of a sudden we see there's value in listening to those who we care for. It's not easy sometimes, believe me. So if you're a parent and you've had kids who make foolish choices, which is about every parent on the planet, it hurts to suffer with your kid. But that's a part of what love involves. If you willingly suffer with them, yes, you're trying to influence them toward what's good and right. You're not passively just doing nothing, but you're also not manipulating and controlling, like you mentioned earlier.
So that, actually, when you think about it from a Christian perspective, that is what we see in Jesus Christ, right?
I sure think so.
We believe this is God stepping into human history. So he genuinely does suffer with us, which is what we call kenosis. But you took that one step further forward, and I try to avoid using technical terms, but kenosis just means Jesus left, or Christ left eternity and stepped in, emptied himself of his godness and walked with us as one of us. But there is, even within that idea, the sense that maybe God could shift from that space to a space where he is fixing stuff, right?
Sorry,
go ahead.
It's pretty common amongst contemporary theologians who call themselves kenosis or canotic theologians to say that God is voluntarily self-limited, that God is self-emptying in some way. I call it self-giving and others empowering. But in their view, God voluntarily does this, at least most of the time. God could occasionally become unself-limited and intervene and fix something single-handedly. And maybe God does that at special times for miracles or whatever. Or, there's various theologians have different views. But the problem with thinking that God is voluntarily self-limited is then you have to look every torture victim in the eye and say, God could have become unself-limited, helped you out, rescued you single-handedly, but for whatever mysterious reason, or God really wanted to teach you a lesson or whatever, God's punishing you. God didn't do that. So I make the claim, and that's the essential kenosis label that you mentioned earlier, that this self-giving, others empowering love isn't something that God voluntarily chooses to do, but it's God's very nature to be like this. And so that means God simply can't intervene to single-handedly rescue. But it does mean God is active, calling, persuading, luring, wooing, to use John Wesley's language, creation toward what is good in every single moment.
So even in the struggle, for example, the recent Black Lives Matter movement, and you see this rising response that's broad-based and not limited to just one racial perspective, but a broad-based movement that's saying, when we say Black Lives Matter, we are in fact saying that everybody matters, because up to the date we've acted like they don't matter, and we want this very inclusive thing. So then you've got this response that says, well, everybody matters, but that's almost ignoring the struggle, right? So all lives matter becomes the response, and it's ignoring, and I don't want to get off of the political equation, but however, well, Black Lives Matter. I 100% am in that space because that's actually saying the right thing. But what I am trying to say here, in terms of essential kenosis, it's not about God fixing political structures or people's opinion, but God wooing humanity to a space that is inclusive and embracing, where all people stand together on an equal playing field. With as poorly as I said that, would that be in some way representing what you're saying?
Yes, that's very well said. Another way I sometimes like to say it is that, love has an element of justice in it.
Mm.
And when I use this word justice, I'm not talking about, God getting retribution, God kicking your butt, God angry and sending pain and suffering, because you've done something wrong. I'm not talking about that kind of punitive justice. I'm
Right,
talking about restorative
right.
or some sort of justice that involves the good of the whole.
Mm.
And I think that's what at the heart of Black Lives Matter is about.
Right,
That
right,
love
right.
means that you look for the good of everyone, but especially the oppressed, those
Exactly.
who are pushed to the
That's
margin.